lights of the studio were hot, the kind that made the air feel heavy even in a room packed with cameras, microphones, and carefully arranged decor. Donald Trump sat in his usual posture, chin up, lips pressed together in that familiar half-smirk, leaning back as though the world revolved around him. The program had been rolling for nearly an hour, the anchor asking questions that probed into policy, polling numbers, and controversies swirling around him. For the most part, he had brushed them off with the kind of swagger that had become his trademark, pivoting to catchphrases that landed with his base and dodging when the conversation veered into uncomfortable territory. But then the subject turned to Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, and in that moment, something shifted. Her name came up as part of a broader discussion about younger lawmakers who had been challenging the status quo in Washington, particularly those who weren't afraid to confront Trump directly. The host asked if Trump believed her style of politics represented a real threat to him or to his movement. Trump chuckled, waving his hand dismissively as though the mere thought of her being a challenge was laughable. With a scoff, he leaned toward the microphone and dropped the line that would soon ripple far beyond the studio walls. She's low IQ. Honestly, she doesn't understand policy. Not smart at all. It wasn't the first time Trump had used that label. The phrase low IQ had been one of his favorite verbal weapons, something he deployed repeatedly against critics over the years. It was short, sharp, and demeaning, designed to stick like a nickname people wouldn't forget. The studio itself seemed to grow quieter after he said it. The anchor glanced quickly toward the production team, recognizing the weight of what had just been said, though Trump himself carried on as if he had simply made an obvious observation. He wore the look of someone who thought he had ended the matter with a flick of the tongue. But live television is unforgiving. Every word spoken is captured, clipped, and replayed endlessly. Within minutes of the remark, viewers were already cutting the footage and posting it online. Headlines started populating on social media feeds, each more attention-grabbing than the last. Trump calls Congresswoman low IQ on live TV. The video clip traveled from platform to platform, racking up thousands of shares before the program even wrapped. What made the comments sting even more was the casualness of it. Trump didn't deliver it as part of a heated debate or after being pressed into a corner. He said it almost lazily, as though dismissing Crockett required no effort at all, as if reducing her entire career and intellect could be done with a shrug and 2 words. The delivery gave the impression that he believed it to be a self-evident truth, not an opinion. That kind of dismissal wasn't new in politics, but the target this time was someone who had built her reputation on never backing down from attacks. People watching from home reacted instantly. Supporters of Crockett felt a wave of outrage, not just because of the insult itself, but because of the broader pattern it reflected. She was a lawyer, a legislator, a woman who had fought to carve out a space in a political world that often dismissed voices like hers. To see her reduced in such blunt terms lit a fire under her base and beyond. Commentators who had been monitoring the program started tweeting in real time, pointing out that Trump's words weren't merely political theater, they were personal. Even those who had grown accustomed to Trump's sharp tongue paused at this one. The insult had been aimed at a woman who prided herself on her sharp analysis and unrelenting commitment to her work. It wasn't just about questioning her politics, it was about questioning her capacity to think, to lead, and to belong in the space she had worked her way into. That nuance made it resonate differently than the countless other barbs Trump had thrown over the years. As the evening wore on, conversations began brewing. Political analysts replayed the clip on cable news, dissecting every word and every gesture. Trump's smirk, the casual wave of his hand, the tone that implied he was stating something obvious, all of it became part of the analysis. The consensus among many commentators was clear. He had underestimated the consequences of his words. What might have sounded to him like an easy punchline was already becoming fuel for a backlash he had not anticipated. The insult, instead of diminishing Crockett, gave her an unexpected spotlight. Viewers who hadn't been closely following her career were now curious. Who was this woman that had provoked such a reaction from Trump? Why did he feel the need to dismiss her in such terms? The comment, meant to belittle, ended up drawing more attention to her than any speech or campaign ad could have done on its own. By the time the clip had gone viral, the stage was already being set for what would follow. The world had heard Trump's words, unfiltered and unmistakable, and the anticipation of Crockett's response began to grow. What had begun as a casual insult on live television was already turning into something far larger, something Trump himself hadn't foreseen. When the clip of Donald Trump dismissing Jasmine Crockett as low IQ began to make the rounds online, many wondered if she would let the insult slide or fire back immediately. Those who knew her well didn't have to wonder for long. Crockett was not the kind of politician who cowered at slights, nor was she someone who let words like that define her. Within hours, she appeared on her own broadcast segment, walking into the studio with the same calm intensity she carried in the halls of Congress. The producers didn't need to build anticipation. The audience was already waiting. Thousands tuning in live, ready to hear what she had to say. Asterisk, she began slowly, almost disarmingly, as if she wasn't rattled at all. With a measured tone, she referenced the insult, not hiding from it, but holding it up to the light for everyone to see. So, apparently last night, I became the latest person to be called low IQ by Donald Trump, she said with a faint smile. The crowd chuckled softly, sensing that she wasn't about to respond with anger, but with precision. She let the pause linger before continuing, her voice steady and clear. I suppose if defending democracy and demanding accountability is considered low IQ, then I'll happily be the smartest fool in the room. Asterisk, the line landed perfectly. Laughter erupted, followed by applause that echoed through the studio. Trump had used the phrase to demean her, but Crockett had already flipped it, transforming the insult into a badge of honor. Rather than bristling, she stood tall and used his words against him, exposing them as shallow and unimaginative. Asterisk, she didn't stop there. With the poise of a lawyer delivering a closing argument, she began breaking down the irony of Trump's attack. She listed her accomplishments, earning her law degree, practicing as a public defender, and rising to Congress where she drafted legislation and fought for communities that were often ignored. Then she drew the contrast sharply, speaking without hesitation. Donald Trump wants to call me unqualified, unintelligent, unfit. This from a man who has faced multiple indictments, run businesses into bankruptcy, and spread lies so often that fact-checkers can't keep up. If I'm low IQ, what does that make him? Asterisk, the audience roared. It wasn't just the words, it was the confidence. Crockett had taken an insult that could have stuck, stripped it of its sting, and turned it back on its source. Trump had hoped to reduce her presence, but in her rebuttal, she magnified it. Every sentence was crafted with sharpness, balancing humor with truth. Her delivery didn't feel rehearsed. It felt authentic, as though she was speaking from a place of deep conviction. Asterisk, as she continued, Crockett leaned into her identity as a fighter. She spoke about the challenges she faced entering politics as a black woman, about the countless times she had been underestimated, and how every dismissal only fueled her determination to prove her critics wrong. Being underestimated has been my superpower, she said, her voice rising slightly. Because while they're busy doubting me, I'm busy doing the work they can't even dream of. The line hit hard, resonating not just with her supporters but with anyone who had ever been dismissed or overlooked. Asterisk. Clips of her response began spreading just as quickly as Trump's original insult. In fact, they spread faster. Social media timelines that had been filled with outrage hours earlier were now buzzing with admiration. Hashtags celebrating Crockett's comeback started trending. Memes showed her words printed over images of her standing confidently, and commentators praised the way she had handled the moment. Even outlets that weren't usually friendly to her admitted she had landed a blow that would be hard for Trump to shake off. Asterisk. What made her response brutal wasn't the volume of her voice or the aggression of her tone, it was the precision. She didn't lose control. She didn't scream or curse. She simply laid out her case with facts, wit, and a clarity that left little room for misinterpretation. By the end of her broadcast, she had not only neutralized Trump's insult, but reframed the conversation entirely. Instead of talking about her intellect, people were talking about her composure, her resilience, and her skill at turning adversity into opportunity. Asterisk for Trump. The moment was a rare miscalculation. He had intended to bury her under a label, but in trying to do so, he gave her the stage and spotlight she needed to shine brighter than ever. Her response didn't just defend her reputation, it elevated it. She showed millions of viewers that an insult could be dismantled with grace, intelligence, and a touch of humor, leaving her critics looking small by comparison. The night after Donald Trump called Jasmine Crockett low IQ, the news cycle was flooded with commentary. Most expected the insult to dominate the narrative, with panelists dissecting what it meant and whether it would stick to her. But something very different happened. The more Crockett spoke, the more she turned the spotlight away from the insult itself and onto her record, her journey, and the contrast between her leadership and Trump's tactics. Instead of getting pulled into a back-and-forth name-calling exchange, she reframed the entire narrative, making sure the focus wasn't on her being labeled, but on what she represented. Asterisk. During her interviews that followed, she leaned into the fact that Trump's remark revealed more about him than it did about her. She reminded viewers of the times he had used the same insult against others, noting that it was a pattern meant to silence people who challenged him. But rather than dwelling on the negativity, she redirected attention to the policies she had worked on, the constituents she served, and the battles she had fought in courtrooms long before she ever entered Congress. Her strategy was clear: turn the insult into an opportunity to showcase her strengths. Asterisk. Crockett spoke about her background as a public defender, recounting stories of defending clients who had no one else to stand up for them. She highlighted the skills she learned in those years, listening carefully, crafting arguments under pressure, and navigating systems designed to be unforgiving. Each story was a reminder that her intellect wasn't something to be questioned, it was something proven through years of service and accomplishment. And she framed all of this in direct contrast to Trump, who she said had built a career on tearing others down rather than lifting anyone up. Asterisk. Her words resonated because they struck at the heart of what people wanted to see in their leaders. While Trump used insults as weapons, Crockett used her story as proof. She didn't have to argue that she was intelligent or capable. Her life's work spoke for itself. But by bringing those details into the conversation, she reminded the public that leadership isn't about swagger or bravado. It's about results. She also widened the lens, pointing out that Trump's insult wasn't just about her, it was about the broader pattern of dismissing women, particularly women of color. In politics, she explained that being labeled as less than was an obstacle she had faced her entire life. But every time someone tried to box her in, she had pushed back harder. "This isn't new," she said during one interview. "It's just louder because this time it came from him. But it won't be the last time someone tries to reduce me, and it won't stop me now, any more than it stopped me then." That framing transformed the moment from a personal slight into a collective rallying cry. Supporters and even people outside of her political circle began to see her response as symbolic of something larger. She was showing that insults, no matter how public or cruel, could be redirected into fuel for change. She turned what might have been a damaging attack into a demonstration of strength, intellect, and resolve. Meanwhile, Trump tried to keep the spotlight on his original words. He doubled down in a later appearance, repeating the insult and insisting he was right. But the more he repeated it, the less effective it became. Instead of landing with force, it began to sound tired and unimaginative, especially when set against Crockett's composed responses. Every time he said low IQ, clips of her powerful rebuttals and articulate interviews spread again, as though his attacks were amplifying her voice instead of silencing it. By the end of the week, news segments weren't framed around Trump's insult anymore. They were framed around how Crockett had taken control of the narrative. Headlines highlighted her resilience, her quick wit, and her ability to rise above. Commentators on both sides admitted that she had turned what could have been a liability into a moment of political capital. She had taken an insult meant to diminish her and reshaped it into a platform to showcase her qualifications and her values. That reframing was what set the moment apart. Trump wanted people to focus on her supposed lack of intelligence, but instead people were talking about her achievements, her eloquence, and her refusal to be defined by someone else's words. Crockett showed that the power of a response isn't in the volume of the rebuttal, but in the ability to control the story that follows. By the time Jasmine Crockett's response to Donald Trump's low IQ insult hit social media, the internet had already begun choosing sides. What started as a few short clips of her rebuttal turned into a digital wave, spreading across platforms with speed that even seasoned political strategists didn't anticipate. Hashtags praising her wit trended within hours, and by the end of the day, her name was at the top of search engines, eclipsing Trump's original comment entirely. The internet is a ruthless judge, quick to mock, quick to amplify, and relentless in its ability to turn moments into movements. Crockett's rebuttal was tailor-made for virality, not because she crafted it that way, but because of the authenticity behind it. She didn't raise her voice or resort to insults of her own. Instead, she delivered lines that were sharp, confident, and layered with just enough humor to be repeated endlessly in memes, TikToks, and Reels. One clip in particular, where she smirked and said, "If that's low IQ, I'll take it," spread like wildfire, stitched into videos of people cheering, clapping, or dancing to music overlays. Trump's insult was still circulating, but it quickly lost traction as Crockett's response became the star of the conversation. Online users began placing the two clips side by side, Trump leaning back with his dismissive smirk, calling her low IQ, and then Crockett, poised and dismantling the insult with humor and substance. The contrast was stark, and it painted him as predictable, while elevating her as quick-witted and fearless. Cable news picked up on the viral storm. Anchors on both liberal and conservative networks replayed the exchanges, some shaking their heads at Trump's choice of words, others acknowledging that Crockett had turned the tables on him. Pundits debated whether he had underestimated her, or simply failed to realize how his old playbook of insults no longer carried the same punch in the digital age. What couldn't be debated, however, was the reach of her response. Every headline that ran with her name extended her influence, drawing in viewers who hadn't paid close attention to her before. Crockett herself leaned into the moment with grace. She didn't gloat or dance on the insult's ashes. Instead, she continued emphasizing the work she was doing in Congress, using interviews and online appearances to bring the focus back to her policy goals. But the internet did the celebrating for her. Supporters clipped her best lines, added captions, and created graphics comparing her resume with Trump's controversies. The effect was a tidal wave of positive attention that no campaign manager could have orchestrated better if they tried. Meanwhile, Trump seemed caught between irritation and determination. True to form, he tried to double down, repeating the insult at another rally, as though saying it louder would make it stick. But the crowd's reaction didn't match the energy he expected. The repetition lacked the shock value of the first moment, and instead of making Crockett look small, it made him look repetitive. Online, users mocked his attempt to revive the jab, posting memes of him recycling the same line while clips of Crockett's confident rebuttal played in parallel. Asterisk. The digital culture that had once fueled Trump's rise was now amplifying his misstep. Crockett's response had become a memeable moment of defiance, a rallying cry for those tired of insults dominating political discourse. The internet didn't just side with her, it celebrated her, creating a narrative where she wasn't merely defending herself, but leading a broader cultural clapback against dismissive politics. Asterisk. By the end of the week, Crockett's rise in visibility was undeniable. Talk shows invited her on, online magazines published think pieces about her strategy, and grassroots supporters used the moment to mobilize around her. Trump, who had intended to reduce her presence with a two-word insult, had instead handed her one of the most significant boosts of her public career. Asterisk. What made the entire situation shocking wasn't just Trump's insult, it was how completely it backfired. He had relied on a familiar tool, expecting it to work the way it always had, but Crockett's unshakable response, combined with the internet's appetite for sharp comebacks, turned his weapon into her platform. In trying to define her, he gave her the very stage she needed to define herself. What began as a careless insult on live television quickly spiraled into one of the most unexpected political moments in recent memory. Donald Trump's attempt to brand Jasmine Crockett as low IQ might have seemed, in his mind, like another throwaway jab, something he had done to countless opponents before. But instead of shrinking under the weight of his dismissal, Crockett seized the opportunity to showcase her sharpness, her resilience, and her refusal to be defined by someone else's words. In doing so, she flipped the script on him in a way that was both subtle and devastating. Asterisk. The first key moment was the insult itself. Casual yet cutting, delivered with a smirk that suggested confidence. Trump believed it was enough to end the discussion, but the power of live television and instant social media ensured his words didn't fade into the ether. They lingered, replayed, and circulated, forcing the world to hear what he had said. That clip alone sparked outrage. But what happened next is what made it unforgettable. Asterisk. Crockett's response was not a loud, emotional retort, but a masterclass in composure. She leaned into humor, layering her rebuttal with sharp observations that both exposed Trump's hypocrisy and elevated her own stature. By doing so, she demonstrated that strength in politics isn't always about being the loudest voice in the room, it's about being the most precise. Her words carried weight because they were measured, authentic, and impossible to dismiss. The internet didn't just hear her response, it amplified it, ensuring millions who never tuned into the original broadcast now saw her handling of the moment. Asterisk. As the dust settled, Crockett reframed the entire narrative. She refused to allow the insult to define her, choosing instead to remind audiences of her accomplishments and her commitment to the work she had been elected to do. In highlighting her own story, she created a powerful contrast between herself and Trump. Where he leaned on insults, she leaned on results. Where he thrived on belittling, she thrived on proving. This shift wasn't just about her defending her intelligence, it was about reclaiming the conversation and placing it squarely where it mattered. On her leadership, asterisk. The virality of the exchange solidified her position even further. Social platforms, cable networks, and everyday conversations centered not on Trump's insult but on Crockett's dismantling of it. His words, meant to weaken, became the spark that strengthened her standing, and as he doubled down, the effect only magnified, highlighting the hollowness of his attack in contrast with the depth of her response. Asterisk. By the end of it, one thing was clear. The attempt to reduce her had instead elevated her. Trump's insult was supposed to be the headline, but Crockett's resilience became the story. It was a reminder that in an age where every word can be replayed endlessly, the true test isn't what is said about you, it's how you choose to respond. Crockett chose with intelligence, with confidence, and with the refusal to be silenced. That choice turned a fleeting jab into a defining moment. Not just for her career, but for anyone who has ever been underestimated.